And we're live. It is Thursday, August 13th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. And the president, knowing today that we were going to have Richard John on to talk about the history of the Postal Service, decided to do us all a favor. He went on Fox News to announce that he was to announce really the reason that he was objecting to new money for the post office, because it would help people vote. The president's gone postal, and lots and lots of people are rightly outraged about it. But I personally am thrilled because it means that our show could not be better timed. And so I want to start with a brief monologue about the Postal Service, wherein I had an awful experience recently, and I want to confess it. I went out on a morning walk and was intending to bring all of Lawfare's mail to the Postal Service to put it in a package and send it to David Priest. Sometimes mail for Lawfare shows up at my house, and then I mail it to David Priest, our chief operating officer, former in lieu of fun guest, and he handles the matters. And I walked out without my mask. And I didn't realize that I had walked out without a mask until I was at the post office opening the door and finding myself confronted by a postal worker who was saying, "You can't come in here without a mask." And I was so flustered. And I was also on the phone. And I'm trying to talk on the phone and signal her that I'm just surrendering. I just don't have a mask, and I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I'm not gonna. And she interpreted it completely wrong. She thought I was being belligerent, and I had visions of myself being captured on one of those viral videos. And then she said, "It's okay, we have one for you if you want one." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And she hands me a mask, and I put it on. And I got in line, and we all stood in line 6 feet apart, and then I mailed my mail to David Priest, and there was no viral video of me being a mask hole, and the horrible, grouchy postal workers were super nice and super friendly, and Lawfare's bills got paid, and I thought, God bless the U.S. Postal Service, and I've been feeling a little bit guilty about it for the several weeks since it happened, because I think I actually did inadvertently convince this poor woman that I was one of these terrible people who refuses to put on a mask, whereas in fact I just didn't have a mask and I was on the phone. And so I've been meaning to unburden myself of this ever since. I can't think of a better father confessor before whom to do it than our current guest. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have Richard John, historian of the Postal Service and other communications technology and business at Columbia University, and one of the people that our guests, our audience keeps asking us to have. The president has given you a better introduction than I can. So welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. It's good to be here. I got my soft drink. So.
Perfect.
Okay, get us started.
Yes.
Yeah, what to say? The post office is older than the Constitution. It received its modern mandate in 1792 with a piece of legislation that was shepherded through Congress by James Madison with the support of George Washington. And it was that time that the institution acquired the civic mandate. That is to say, it wasn't simply going to facilitate commerce, although commerce has a civic dimension, as we know from David Hume and Adam Smith, but it was also going to facilitate the circulation of information on public affairs. And it would do that through kind of ingenious mechanism that they kind of worked out, as often happens in the federal government, over time. You would petition your congressman for new routes. You'd get the new route, and no one really worried about whether or not that route was going to pay for itself. Better still, what do you get in the mail? You get newspapers. In 1792, Congress decreed that all newspapers would go in the mail at a very low rate. Not for nothing. Madison thought that would be a problem for administrative reasons, and that's a complicated little story in and of itself, but at very low cost. Well, how low cost? Well, newspapers were never more than 15% of the weight of the mail in Tocqueville's America, the 1830s, but they were about 95%, not 15% of the revenue, but 95% of the weight, right? Revenue versus weight. So they're much more expensive to convey than the post office was getting. So there's never that kind of utilitarian link between cost and price, which was so important in Great Britain for the economical reformers, Rowland Hill's generation. Instead, right from the beginning, civic mandate to circulate information hither, thither, and yon. And there's something else in the Post Office Act of 1792 that the lawmakers were very concerned about, and that was that you were not permitted, no postal officer, no government officer, with one very distinctive exception, it was exception proves the rule, was permitted to open anyone's letters. Right? So the correspondence was confidential. Now, big deal. Well, merchants are the main users of the post office, the main postage payers, right? You're getting newspapers, but that's not where the revenue's coming from. Merchants are the main contributor to revenue, and they're sending money in the mail. They're sending $5,000 in banknotes, sometimes more. Sometimes they cut them in half, sometimes they didn't. All went uninsured. And merchants wouldn't have done that if they had any suspicion that the post office was not secure. So that's the civic foundation for post office. Circulation of information on public affairs. Congress, rather than the executive, is in charge. Postmaster General wanted to keep control of the designation of new routes. He didn't want that to go to Congress because in the olden days, before 1792, to show you were a successful administrator, you broke even or you generated revenue for the government. The British post office was revenue generating well into the 20th century. And that's what Franklin did. He made money for the crown. That's why he was celebrated. 1792 on, that was not the goal of the Postmaster General. The goal of the Postmaster General was to help make possible this extraordinary experiment, which is representative government, make possible democracy, right? And now that's the founding at that time, and the institution expands like Topsy after that. So by the time election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, American Post Office is by far the biggest in the world in terms of the density of the network, in terms of volume, much bigger, that is to say, than postal network in Britain or France. So Tocqueville comes and he sees this institution working, talks about it, circulation of newspapers. He goes to Michigan, which was then the very, very edge of the wilderness, frontier, as it were, and he discovers that the pioneer in Michigan is just as well as informed as a New Yorker. And that's because the Michiganders have their Bible, their Acts, and their newspaper. The newspaper came because it was subsidized through the post office. So that's the kind of that's the bottom line. That's the foundation. That's the civic mandate for the post office that I fear is not as well understood today as it really ought to be. We could not have had democracy without the post office. If we want to make America great again, let's find ways to support the post office.
Hear, hear. Ben, you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry.
No, he's on
We
mute.
hear you just fine. I muted myself because I didn't want to create an echo, but and then I forgot. So let's talk about the role of the post office in voting, since the president does seem to want to prevent that. What do we know about when the post office began to play a role not just in informational democracy, but in actual
Like
voting,
democracy.
like the democracy part of democracy?
Yeah, Tom Wheeler had a nice piece on this in Brookings today. And he reminds us that mail-in voting was important in the American Civil War.
We know Tom. He came on the show
Yeah.
once.
Right.
Former Brookings colleague of mine and former in lieu of
He
fun
was
guest.
great. He was
No,
good
very
fun.
good. Well, he did a fine piece.
Good.
And he has the wrinkle that there were journalists who contended that Lincoln might well lose if you had postal balloting, mail-in voting. But Lincoln thought it was important. And you have mail-in voting. In Indiana, I think if I got the story right, the governor didn't want mail-in voting, so the troops had to go home. But in several states, there was mail-in voting civil war. And you can even find examples of mail-in voting in the War of Independence. In fact, the history of mail-in voting is very closely linked with the determination of the military to ensure that soldiers can vote. After all, a lot of American soldiers are overseas, have been for a long time. There's actually an office in the Pentagon that their job is to make sure that soldiers who are not, within the territorial limits of the United States, all these military bases, that they can vote. In fact, Alex Kasar had a fine piece on that in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. So we've been voting by mail for a very long time. And, is it a lot of mail? No. And the post office delivers half the world's mail. The current Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, built a reputation as a logistics guy. Well, if he's a logistics guy, it should be a piece of cake to figure out mail-in voting. Come on! He's a businessman. He should know what he's doing. Think of John Wanamaker. Think of the great postmaster generals in the past. They figured out ways to get the job done, to move information, not to toady to some public figure who's making these really quite incendiary claims about the suffrage, right? To claim that you don't want urban Americans to vote because urban Americans might not vote for you, this is really strange stuff for a historian. Very strange. This is not making America great again. This is incipient authoritarian balderdash. That seems to be what we heard today. I don't normally speak like that, but it is quite strange.
Authoritarian balderdash. I will take it. I have a very... I don't know if this is even a very good question, but I was looking up your book in the post office, and it's from 1792 to 1914.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you stop in 1914?
Oh, you're talking about the 4-volume collection of documents.
Oh, is that why? Okay,
Yeah.
That makes more sense now. Okay.
That book ends in 1914 because, as often happens, I had an editor who said, no, don't go past 1914. And I said, okay, let's get the thing done. So that book just goes to 1914, but 1914 is, the start of the European conflict. It was being published in Britain, so they thought that was a nice logical deadline. There were some innovations that occurred in the Taft and Wilson administrations. We had postal banking in 1910. We had parcel post under Wilson. So it sort of does end an era in the history of the institution. But my post office monograph goes from the 1790s to the 1840s, but the narrative really ends in 1835. So I don't want the president to hear this, but the biggest crisis...
Don't worry, he doesn't watch.
Yeah, the biggest crisis that the post office ever confronted was in the 1840s, and I'd love to write a book about it one day, because there were plenty of calls for privatizing the post office and the commercial press, journalists, and it was a much bigger problem than they had in the 1960s, and certainly a much bigger problem really than they have today. The institute was breaking down. You had private carriers that were contesting key urban markets because of the way the rates were structured. You can learn more about that in the book. And the Congress had to do something. And they did in 1845. They introduced, or got it on my tie, the postage stamp. They lowered the cost of mailing a letter substantially, which made it possible for ordinary people to use the post office. But more importantly, that brought the merchant's mail back into the circuit, because merchants were abandoning the institution in large numbers because it was much more expensive to send mail to the post office than it was to send it to private carriers. There was a bank in California, Wells Fargo, which started by Henry Wells and William Fargo, and they got into that private mail delivery business. And there were some other folks in that business, including a kind of a libertarian poster child named Lysander Spooner. Every once in a while on college campuses, students will have Lysander Spooner t-shirts. Anyway, that's why the book only goes to the 1830s. And it really stops in this kind of dramatic episode when the abolitionists based in New York City, who sought the immediate end of slavery, which is an extraordinarily radical position in the 1830s, they tried to use the post office to leverage the institution to flood the South with abolitionist tracts, basically religious appeals. And this antagonized Southerners who did not like being told they were going to hell if they didn't free their slaves. And so the Southerners responded by blocking the circulation of literature dealing with the slavery question. You had a cordon sanitaire from 1835 until, really the end of the Civil War. The South is out. But Abraham Lincoln, when he came into office in 1860, was feared in part because Southerners warned that if you have a Republican in office, he will appoint abolitionist postmasters who will open the spigot and the flood of abolitionist literature will return. And I mention this because we've had a lot of writing in this country about civil liberties and about free expression and the First Amendment. We don't seem to spend a lot of time on the blockage of literature on one of the key public issues of the day for, 35, 45, 55, 25 years. That's much more consequential than the Alien and Sedition Act. And year after year after year, we hear about the Alien Sedition Act. We don't hear much about the abolitionist males controversy. I wish someone would get on the stick and write the big book on that for our day, because it's
you should do it.
Political issue, and that's how the post office book ended. That's what you asked.
So that's a really interesting point. So Trump's effort to appoint highly political people to run the postal service. It's really not the beginning of the politicization of the postal service story, right? My recollection is the postmasters' general positions were exceedingly valued political spoils. So when did this idea that the post office should be apolitical and should just kind of carry the mail and not think about content? I mean, postal inspectors, of course, were a big deal during Prohibition. When did the idea that that politics and the mail shouldn't be really related to one another, when does that arise?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me make a distinction I think will be helpful. Beginning with Andrew Jackson and continuing through the 1960s, the Postmaster General was more often than not the party chair or a key politico. Okay, Larry O'Brien. So you'd always know who the Postmaster General would be. Once the president elected, it would be the party chairman. James Farley, for example. He knew 30,000 names or something. They were very political people. But there was a distinction between being a political actor and interfering with the circulation of information, right? That is a distinction. Now, there were moments in history. The 1880 election is one where it was charged that the post office was being used to help elect Garfield. But that was through postal money from postal contracting, okay? Remember, the 1835 controversy was a controversy between the federal government and the states. Andrew Jackson, one of the few times a president before the current president has made a policy statement about the post office in the height of a national crisis. I've been trying to think of other examples. There aren't a lot of them. And to be honest, there aren't many other people out there who've read what every president said about the post office, into the 20th century. So if there's somebody else out there and I missed something, let me know. 1835, Jackson wanted a federal law banning the circulation of abolitionist literature through the mails. Now, John C. Calhoun was cleverer than Andrew Jackson. He says if you enact a law saying you ban it, wait a minute, you can turn around tomorrow and enact a law saying you can circulate it. So the Postmaster General, Amos Kendall, decided that we're going to rely on the states to figure it out, right? Kind of they had fancy legal terms for that. I forget what the term was they used. The states would decide. And that's when you're mixing it up politically. But that was an issue that was that was an issue that was settled in order to encourage and promote the circulation of merchants' mail. Because nothing would be worse from the point of view of Southern merchants, planters, bankers, than to have these poor whites running amok, tearing open the mailbags to look for abolitionist literature. You see, that would be an excuse for kind of pilferage. And they didn't want that. So there was this distinction. It was kind of like a firewall, a church-state distinction between the jobs for postal people and the sanctity of the institution itself. And yes, about 90% of federal jobs were in the post office. Thousands of postmasterships turned over every 4 years when you had a new Postmaster General. By the 1870s, there was an institution inside the post office that was kind of the core of the civil service, and that was the railway mail service, which is an extraordinary chapter in the history of the mail. We just know instinctively, New York City, big post office. Well, wait a minute, railway station right next door. Chicago, the same, Washington, D.C., because they moved the mail by railroad, and they sorted it en route, which is pretty extraordinary. The idea was to make it possible to send a letter from New York to Chicago from any place on the route as fast as a passenger could travel. Of course, a passenger gets on the train, gets off the train, right? But you have to do that with a lot of mail. So there's the core then of civil service, which was expanded with, of course, with the Pendleton Act in 1883 after the assassination of Garfield, and gradually there's a mopping up operation that more and more of the staff of the post office is incorporated until the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And you get the government is so confident in civil service they can segregate it, right? Which they do in Washington, D.C., which, of course, is a dark chapter. But you have to have a kind of a routinized institution. You have that. Local postmasters still not routinized, but that was true for the core of the system. And you need to understand just how enormously important the circulation of information and then of parcels was through the post office. It was at the very center of the commercial economy. I heard the other day from a lobbyist for 21st century post office, about a seventh of the economy right now goes through the post office. Well, anything more than that went through the post office in the early 20th century. It was an element of civilization, unmatched. It was the world's greatest business. So the institution had to run well, and it did, and it still runs well. And the Postmaster General should take pride in that. He's a logistics guy. Why can't you get your act together, move the mail, tell the country that we are going to ensure that absolutely every single ballot that goes through the mail not only is paid for, but it's going to be counted before Election Day. I'm going to have the staff there to do that. That's what the Postmaster General should be doing. That's what the Postmaster Generals did in the past. That's how we made America great in the first place. Let's get on the stick. Get something done.
I'm okay. So I want to say, as long as I've been alive, which is less than Ben, and probably less than you, but I'm not sure. The post office has been running out of money. I've always have heard this, right? And that seems to be part of the yet it always they raise the price of stamps, they're still running out of money. Yeah. The internet has killed the post office, all of these things. At some point, is that something that's just going to what's going on with why the post office keeps losing money? And that seems to be the reason. And as you said, it still runs well. It does run pretty well, frankly. It's right now it's much better than where I am. It's much better than private mail carriers. UPS hasn't been here in 2 weeks. And all of my packages are delayed. But I'm just curious, like what's going on, why it's always underwater.
So I'm not a lawyer, but let's raise a question about the premise. Post office losing money. Why is that a thing? For most of the history of the post office, it just wasn't an issue. From the 1790s to the 1830s, the post office either broke even or returned money to the general treasury. British post office, by the way, made money until the 1950s, right? That's why the British postal reforms are really much less daring than the American postal reforms, because they had lots of surplus to play with. Beginning in the 1830s, the post office begins to bring in less money than it pays out in mail contracting, okay? So you could say it's running a deficit. 1851, the lawmakers say, wait a minute, we are not going to shut down a single post office or close a single route if that route is unprofitable. So from 1851 until the 1960s, guess what? The post office, cup in hand, went to Congress every year for funding. And no one really cared outside of Congress. I mean, again, if there's anybody out there who's read the speeches over postal appropriations in the late 19th, early 20th century, you can get high and mighty about it for a couple of hours, stem winders. Nobody really cares. No one talks about privatizing the post office. There are a few exceptions, but almost none, after the 1840s. Instead, the argument is different. The argument goes like this. Why can't Western Union, the telegraph giant, run more like the post office? That was the argument in the 1870s and 1880s. Ulysses S. Grant wanted the government to buy out Western Union and run it like the post office. So the idea was it was a service and not a business. And that was a very important distinction. The military doesn't make money, right? Does the water company make a lot of money? The post office is infrastructure. It's part of the DNA of a self-governing people. So to say that it's losing money is an argument that was popularized 1960s. No, let me just make a step back before I get to the 1960s. There is concern in the 19th century that you shouldn't run too big a deficit. Or if you are running a deficit, it's really not a deficit because, well, wait a minute, you're providing all these low-cost services for congressmen and Alaskans and other groups that somehow have got their finger on the congressional pulse. Okay, so that's the way they justify it. You don't want to get it too big because it could be a sink of patronage and corruption, right? After the Second World War, there were lots of pots that kind of lobbyists could turn to if they wanted to twiddle the dials in Washington beside the post office. So the post office ceased to be that important for patronage. And then the 1960s, railroads are declining. Volume is still high. You have some civil rights issues in Chicago and other cities. They're making a transition from railroad-based to kind of warehouse-based or urban sorting center-based infrastructure. And you had in Chicago, there was the big couple months when they simply stopped being able to deliver the mail. I think it was in '66, and they brought in the army and so on. And then and that led to the Capitol Commission. Capitol was the CEO of the Bell system. And as CEO of the Bell system, he didn't want to entirely privatize the post office because Bell wasn't privatized. Bell was run like a public utility. So let's run the post office more like a public utility. And it was at that time that you begin to get more talk about business and accountability. But Congress declared again and again and again it's a service and not a business. And in 1970, it was clear that the post office was going to continue providing all kinds of facilities that no private company would. Right now, the Postmaster General has been trying for years to eliminate Saturday mail delivery, and you can't do that. If you can't decide when you're providing the service, you really are constrained. And it's those constraints, plus the really bizarre provision of the 2006 Postal Accountability Act that obliged the Postmaster General to pay ahead pensions, that's a problem, along with, of course, the internet and COVID-19. But the parcel business is looking up for the post office. It remains a cornerstone of commerce, public life throughout the country, especially in rural areas, and especially in rural areas in red states. And this is one reason that we have not had a president or a presidential candidate up till now that I am aware of talk about the post office in this way. I mean, Romney wanted to privatize Big Bird, but as far as I remember, not the post office. So this may be a kind of a wake-up call for a lot of Americans in those red states that might otherwise be predisposed to be sympathetic to Donald Trump, is what the polling data says. Because if you do eliminate the post office, which I don't think is going to happen, but a lot of things that I didn't think are going to happen. If you do that, it's going to make it very hard for Main Street, small town merchants, veterans trying to get their prescription drugs, and a lot of other Americans. And it's going to be a real problem for Amazon, Federal Express, and UPS because they all work closely with the post office. So, I don't do the future, but I don't think we really appreciate how important the post office is to the functioning 21st century economy. And also now with COVID-19 to our experiment in self-government, to the core values of democracy.
So before, I just want to talk about the next 3 months briefly. The president is upset because the post office may deliver ballots. He's put this crony of his in charge as Postmaster General, and he's objecting to funding that the post office needs and that Democrats want in Congress want to give. Yeah. What is the capacity of the president at this stage to interfere with the post office's ability to play the role in the election that people are counting on it to play?
It's really hard to think of historical precedents for what happened today and what has happened in the last month or so. That is to say, president trying to intervene directly in the operations of post office in order to undermine the electoral process. That's really strange. So I would assume that the Postmaster General, who's not getting very good press right now, but if he's worried about his tombstone and his reputation and his maker, that he should be redoubling his efforts to ensure that this organization is functioning as well as it can, and simply don't pay any attention to what's coming out of the White House. That's what happened, I suppose you could say, with Andrew Jackson in 1835. Lawmakers, more prudent statesmen intervened, and he didn't get what he wanted. That may be the analogy with today. I've been trying to think of other analogies, and they're really hard to come by. I mean, I would have been delighted if a president had taken a policy stand on the post office that I could write about or other people could write about. But it just hasn't happened. You've got Andrew Jackson, and now you've got Trump, and maybe that it's appropriate then that you have that portrait of Jackson in the Oval Office. I mean, Thomas Jefferson in a letter talked about, let's try to get rid of the post office, but that didn't affect public policy. There's almost no policy statement by Thomas Jefferson on this subject. Woodrow Wilson didn't say much, except in their annual statements where they just tell you what the revenue looks like and, what new services are. So this is something that is new, surprising, unsettling, and it certainly should trouble, if anyone, it should trouble conservatives, because if you don't have well-functioning core institutions to make possible self-government, then you don't really have a republic. So that's anyway. Those are some thoughts. It is startling.
You're confusing Republicans like the party with people who actually care about the republic, but that's. But yes, your point is really well taken. I think that we have a question. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Really a fabulous history lesson here. What suggestions do you have for your basic American citizen to affect change at this time? What can the American citizen do to help the postal system?
Well, one thing Americans have been doing to help the postal system, or at least to express their views on the postal system. This is why I wrote my book in the first place, by the way, kind of weirdly, is to petition and to contact lawmakers, especially congressmen and congresspeople, I guess we'd say, and make it clear that this is a valuable institution and you don't want this institution to be undermined. Every post route from the 1790s to the Civil War, 1870s maybe, had to be preceded by a petition, and there are hundreds, thousands of signatures to Congress, and Americans are petitioning about postal matters, every year since. So that's one thing that ordinary Americans can do. It might also help to just show up at the post office and use the facilities. I really, I feel for the men and women who work for our post office, many of whom are veterans, many of whom are people of color, about 500,000. I mean, to have their work disparaged, be called a joke by the President of the United States is insulting, and it must be demoralizing, and it's just strange. So that's something else ordinary people, ordinary man in the street, woman in the street could do. Make it known that this is not normal, this is not acceptable, and this is not how we made America great in the first place.
Ben.
Oh, what am I supposed to do?
No, he's on mute.
Oh.
I don't know why I was on mute. Daniel Burge asks, Barbara Jack asks a follow-up question, which is whether buying stamps helps. Is that supporting the post office, or is that using the system, actually creating additional workload and drain on it?
No, buying stamps is a great idea. I mean, for much of the 20th century, one of the most popular hobbies in the country was stamp collecting, or philately, as it's called. And the post office discovered this was really a really great thing. FDR was a stamp collector. You've got lots of Americans who were buying stamps and then not using the service, so that's good. Now, if you buy stamps and use the service, that's fine too. It's this is not some fragile potted plant. This is one of the most robust organizations that we've managed to create on this planet. Half the world's mail goes through the post office. They can take it. Bring it on. Sure, use the institution. Send out, wedding announcements. Graduation. My daughter just sent out lots of graduation announcements.
You're on mute, Ben.
Yeah, use the post office, of course.
No one gets married anymore, as I think.
Send out wedding announcements, even if you're not getting married. Send out wedding announcements for people you've never met. Just confuse the public, but use the post office to do it.
I did that inadvertently once. I sent out like a happy picture of like my partner and I, who are not married but have been together for many, many years, and I sent out a postcard for the New Year, but it didn't say Happy New Year. It was just like some like generic hope you're like everything is gonna be great kind of day, and people thought it was an engagement announcement, and everyone called me. I was like, no, it's for New Year's. It was just anyway.
But the more important revenue source right now is parcels. So if you want to help the post office and you have a choice, have the parcel
send a
delivered
package.
to the post office. Yeah.
Go in, wear your mask, and send the mail that gets delivered to your house, to your chief operating officer's house. That's in a parcel.
To mail you your lamb prosciutto, Ben.
I want my lamb prosciutto.
Yeah.
And yes, Joe Peters points out that you can send Kate and me wine and bourbon.
That's true.
So, okay, we have some more questions in the queue. I'm going to read these. I think you've kind of already answered this. But if you had to draw a distant historical antecedent to what Trump is doing now, is there any episode you would pick?
Yeah. Andrew Jackson intervening.
I was just going to say Jackson.
That's the best I've got. I mean, other presidents who there has to be a crisis. So Nixon had a crisis in the 60s because the mail wasn't being moved. But that was simply, we're going to use the troop, we're going to use the army, we're going to use the National Guard, whatever. I forget who they used. And that's another kind of crisis when the system isn't working well. But other chapters in our history where the post office has been that central to a national consciousness, national election. I mean, I've been looking, and they're really hard to find. When Ulysses S. Grant made a policy statement that the post office should take over the telegraph, which was in federal law, 1866, that's an interesting policy statement by a president that was controversial, but that wasn't at the time of a crisis. Presidents generally are admiring of the post office because, they're president of the government and it's working really well. Right now, 90% of Americans think the post office is doing a great job. It's the most popular institution in the entire federal bureaucracy. It's a lot more popular than the president or Congress or the IRS or wherever you go. So why not take credit for the achievements that are taking place under your watch? That's been the attitude of presidents up to the present. And I've been scratching my head to try to come up with counter examples, but maybe someone can email me with, but I don't, certainly not before the First World War. And, does Arthur Summerfield get agitated about anything going in the post office? No. Does James Farley? No. It's startling. And it's unsettling because the post office is part of our DNA. It's like attacking America. I mean, presidents don't do that. Presidents defend America, right? And so that's the puzzle.
So before you ask your question, Lieu poses a very interesting question. To what extent can we look at the post-political history of the post office as a way to learn about the history of administrative agencies more generally?
What a great question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's look at it in a couple of stages. 1790s, federal government, nascent bureaucracy. You have these sorting centers. So you have a middle level of bureaucracy before 1800, what Al Chandler would call middle management. I convinced him of this. You got middle management in the post office, 1800. All right. 1830s, you've got this dual federalism model. So the states do some things and the federal government does others. And that's because the federal government is kind of extending its reach into localities. A good example was the controversy over the movement of the mail on the Sabbath, right? You're going to open up post offices, move mail on the Sabbath. Well, wait a minute. In a lot of states, it was illegal to open a business or to run a stagecoach or other public services on the Sabbath. But post office could move the mail on the Sabbath, could open post offices. So that's a moment. 1870s, another key juncture when you get a technically proficient, self-conscious elite in the bowels of the post office, in the railway mail service, and that expands into the cities, and then you had pneumatic tubes, which is complicated technically, and that will expand right up to the Second World War. After the Second World War, then you have movements to kind of decentralize and repurpose now this pretty urban-centered, focused administrative organization. And then that leads to the development for the first time, really of professional managers. That is to say, who come out of business or engineering to run these big sorting centers. And that's going to be 1940s, 50s, 60s. Then after 1970, it's reorganized. It's meant to be nonpartisan. It's going to be run along the lines of, say, AT&T or other big, corporate liberal institutions. Those would be the main. I think those would be the main chapters. And by the way, there was a lot of innovation inside the post office, especially in areas like digital coding and what become the zip code. If you think about the volume of mail, then you realize that it's become extraordinarily important to figure out how to speed the movement of mail, and to do that, you need to have all of these digital tools, and that's 50s, 60s, 70s, and onward. So now you've got a cadre in the post office who are concerned specifically with high-tech digital economy. Yeah. So.
Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was just to get back to your kind of your underlying history lesson at the start of the show, which was about how, the post office was, responsible for the dissemination of information through subsidized sending of newspapers.
Right.
And it just kind of reminded me of it makes sense that you're like a history of communication, because I don't know, there's one way to think of the post office, which is as this kind of semi administrative state, and then there's another way to think about it as like this disseminator of information. How relevant do you find the post office, just like it being called a service? How much do you think that's relevant to the debate that we're kind of having right now around net neutrality, around kind of the FCC involvement with the internet, all of these types of things? Is that something that you think kind of would come to bear on this?
Yeah, let me tell a story, and I'll get into it. You had reformers in the 1870s and 80s who wanted the post office to take over the telegraph, but did not want the post office to convey parcels weighing more than 4 pounds. That's because the post office was meant to circulate information and not goods. Okay, so there was a close identification between the institution and the circulation of information going way back, and it was very important for commerce. Now, the beef I have with the net neutrality champions who go back to the post office is that they want, as I understand it, all bits and bytes to kind of go at the same rate without anyone sorting anything or differentiating. The post office always
differentiated.
Always differentiated. So the whole point was the newspapers were heavy and they were bulky and they were difficult to transmit, but they go really cheaply because the quality of the information mattered. The trouble with the net neutrality debate, and I've talked with Tim about this, gone back and forth on this, is that it doesn't, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on the interstices, but it doesn't make distinction between different classes of information.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. No,
you're
correct.
For journalism.
No, but the better analogy for net neutrality, and I'm not a particular net neutrality geek, but the better analogy for net neutrality is end-to-end telephony,
okay.
Right? And
yes.
where you're allowed to privately own this network, but you have to have a non-discrimination principle as to content.
That's exactly right. Because now you are judging content, the quality of various types of content in the USPS model. Okay, so
let me talk about the end-to-end model, and it's worth recalling, and I wrote about this in another book called The Network Nation, that one of the most visionary Bell leaders, Bell system, the 20th century, a fellow by the name of Theodore Vail, he cut his teeth as a young man as an administrator in the railway mail service, in the post office. So end to end was very important to Vail. And that's a very important principle in the post office, that they don't want anybody else other than a postal officer handling the mail, and it's all going to go in a there's not going to be any preference within the classes. Some classes might go faster than others. Certain catalogs wouldn't go as fast as business correspondence and the like. But within those classes, it would be impartial. Remember, you're not allowed to open anyone's letters either. And that was a problem if you were, say, trying to block the circulation of information on abortion or birth control or,
absolutely,
moral matters.
Bomb building.
Right. Yeah.
Bomb building.
Yeah, that's a problem, right? Okay. But having said that, that is an analogy. It's basic infrastructure. And there was an esprit de corps, a commitment to getting the job done that you had in Bell, that you have in the post office and still do to this day. That's where I would make the analogy. But they do differentiate on the basis of, and so did Bell. This is one of the weird things about the Bell debate. They differentiate between short distance and long distance, and they subsidize whether you were calling in the evening versus calling in the morning. The internet, in part, was made possible because they had all this unused capacity at night because of the business people were not calling. So just to say it's all going to be the same and it's all going to be undifferentiated, that is $1 billion gift to Google. And I don't really think that that's the game we should all be in, is kind of lobbying for Google. That's an opinion, but I think there are more important civic issues that we should be concerned about than that one. And the circulation of information, and what is more important civic information in this day and age than your decision as to who you want to represent you, who you want to be president. That is vital civic information. That's exactly what the founders intended the post office, the sort of thing that the post office should do.
Yeah.
Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Hi, I have a question about how quickly can the post office be dismantled or its service be severely affected? Yeah. And is it possible they can simply be slow in reacting like everything else in the government and drag their feet?
Yeah, I mean, I thought a little bit about this. The post office, like a lot of other big organizations, has inertia, momentum. It's been running for a long time. Congress remains very important in the sort of the relationship between the post office and the federal government. It's not just the postal governors or the Postal Regulatory Commission, but it's Congress. And congressmen know full well, congressmen and congresswomen know full well that constituents care about the post office. They don't like it when their Social Security checks don't get through. They certainly don't like it when a local post office is shut down. They might not even like it when a certain level of service is shifted. We don't have, we still have Saturday mail delivery. So Congress is an important intermediary. But will we just wake up one day and the postman doesn't come anymore? I don't do the future, but that would be quite a remarkable turn of events. So the civic engagement is important. Keeping, I guess, the issue in the press is important. And trying to, I'm really puzzled by how the current Postmaster General must be thinking day to day about what he's doing, because he is a successful businessman who's built a career in logistics. The post office is all about logistics. Why can't he get on top of this and make the institution, just run as well as it ever has? Shouldn't that be his number one goal right now for all Americans? Because the institution has been intended to run for all Americans. So that's what I would say. I don't predict. I don't know what's going to happen between now and November.
I just want to say that the best line that I think one of the best lines we've ever had from a historian is, I don't do the future.
Yeah.
I think that was
And we know enough about historians who have made predictions because we keep track of that sort of thing, and we know how often historians are wrong. So historians are poor prophets.
True. But you are, but you are a hell of a lot of something other than fun to talk to. So very glad that you were able to come on the show today.
I'm putting the poll of the day together, and it will be up in just a second. Kate's going to talk in the meantime.
Okay.
I was just gonna. Well, I studied history under Gordon Wood.
Oh yes.
And I really one of the things that I'll never forget going to his office hours and saying to him, maybe it was like the future that I would be a professor of the internet, going to his office hours and saying to him, do you think that the revolution would have happened if instead of like ships they had cell phones? And he was like, he just like didn't know, like he was just kind of like, yeah, he was just kind of, but my point being was that basically there was no reliable source of information, and half of the things that happened that kind of separated and caused the revolution in large part happened because there was no direct and very limited kind of authoritarian control over the colonies at the time, and very few actual directions kind of happening from the crown. So that was like, anyways, that was one of the many lessons that kind of like came out of that, but maybe you disagree. But
well, you know, one of the things that historians of communications are troubled by, once information was slow and it was limited, and you know, there were plenty of newspapers going back and forth. There was a lot of civic engagement. We had committees of correspondence. In the colonial era, the information didn't get that far out into the hinterland, but there weren't that many people in the hinterland. So, you know, there's an early modern historian who talks about information overload in the 16th century. So there was a lot of information going hither, thither, and yon. Yeah. But there was great concern in the 1780s that if we're going to have a federal government of the kind that the Constitution proposed, that ordinary Americans should have access to information on public affairs on a regular basis, and they did not believe that the information they would get from their lawmakers when their lawmakers came home was adequate. And that was the bottom line rationale for Post Office Act of 1792. There's not many discussions of public opinion in the Federalist. There's a couple, but not very many. The essays of Madison and Jay and Hamilton, 1860. You can do a Google, you can just go in, you can just check it. Not that many references. By 1791-92, Madison's talking all about public opinion. And the public opinion is going to be circulated through newspapers, and newspapers are going to be circulated through the mail. So that's the difference. I mean, Gordon Wood has he tends not to put much emphasis on big organizations like banks, post office. His radicalism of American Revolution in some ways is a kind of it's an kind of anti-federalist perspective. So there are other historians.
No, it certainly is, yes.
You know, there are other historians, say Rose Smith and Pauline Mayer, MIT, perhaps because they're teaching at MIT, they put more emphasis on the role of large-scale organizations. Paul Starr, sociologist at Princeton, does more. So Gordon, I think, in some ways has a sort of a romantic view of ordinary people kicking up their heels in the backwoods and making it work. But it didn't work that way. It worked because you had dedicated public figures establishing enduring institutions to facilitate circulation of goods, of information, and of people. And that required large organizations. And the post office was one of the largest organizations in the world for the 19th century. And so if we care about infrastructure, which is another word for civilization, then it seems to me we should pay a lot of attention to organizations like the post office and recognize how essential it remains for day-to-day life today and for the security of our electoral process and the perpetuation of our remarkable experiment in self-government.
We are going to leave it there.
Wait, did you vote in the poll?
Oh, is there a poll?
There, the poll is out. Right now, first class mail is winning. My favorite, which is junk mail, is only got one vote. No, I did. I don't get to vote in the poll.
You don't get to vote in the poll.
I don't get to. Somebody else voted for junk. I love junk mail.
What the hell is wrong with you, Ben? Really? I love that there's 0 votes for the friendly service, despite the lovely story that you told at the beginning.
Did you know that Andy Warhol had a stamp collection? And his stamp collection was whenever he got his mail, he would cut the stamps off of the letters. He particularly liked metered postage because they were completely standardized and undistinctive from one another. Yeah. And so, I'm first class mail definitely seems to be winning the poll, with packages a distant second. My vote, for whatever it's worth, is for junk mail, which is the best.
What was your vote for? Richard's vote.
I didn't know it was a poll. What is there? Is there? Ask
if you.
It's down at the bottom.
If you go down to the bottom, there's a little thing on the
and it says
polls,
and it has it should have a little orange dot next to it.
Sorry, I missed a poll. So do I circulate? Oh, I see. Getting postcards, packages, junk mail. Oh, my favorite thing about the post office is first class mail. No one says I hate the post office. Well, that's
no one hates the post office on In Lieu of Fun.
I mean, now hating the post office is like being for
I'm going to go with packages because I think that is going to be the future of the institution more so. But again, I don't predict. But if you look at the last 10 years, packages have become important. And by the way, let me just say one more thing. FedEx and UPS are working with the post office. Now, there is a fellow by the name of Koch, one of the Koch brothers, who's been trying to privatize the post office. And, that's a kind of libertarian fantasy. It has been for a long time. But it's really hard to find large numbers of people who embrace that particular fantasy, because the institution is very popular and provides a service for everyone. So having said that, there are going to be adjustments with the internet. You're going to, first class mail's going down. Parcels is the future, at least as I understand it. And I've talked with administrators about that. And it's going to be the post office working together, providing what's called a last mile, right? With UPS and with FedEx. You really want all those trucks in the city? You can have just one carrier, post office. And you can work with other carriers. And in some ways, that's what we've done in the past. There have been lots of accommodations to, stagecoaches were not government owned and operated. Railroads were not government owned and operated. Airlines were not. But you would not have had the airline industry without those postal subsidies. So it's the post office, Amazon working together, post office, UPS, Federal Express working together. I think that's the future. And, the post office is going to do it cheaper. It's going to do it on a scale that no one else can do. I think I read this statistic a little while ago that UPS and Federal Express, the number of parcels they deliver is what the post office does in 13 days. In a year, 13 days. So something like that. The scale is just so different. So they'll work together. But if we figure out a way to get the pension situation taken care of, that's a bookkeeping matter. If we figure out a way to get them working together, which they have been doing, if we just stop making these ridiculous statements like saying the post office is a joke, what kind of a statement is that? And we kind of recognize how important this institution is in this extraordinary time, COVID-19, so that we can not only deliver the mail, but also make it possible for ordinary Americans to make their voices heard, right? The halls of power. Then I think we got a bright future for the post office.
We are going to leave it there. Richard, John, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely amazing.
I'm glad I got to vote. I'm glad I got to vote. I did.
Everyone get out there.
We're not about disenfranchisement here.
Buy some forever stamps. You can keep them forever.
That's a good one.
You get your stamps. They hang out in your house. They never get old.
That's
you don't even have to lick them anymore.
Nope, that's right.
It's a great deal. Kate, who do we have tomorrow?
I don't remember. We do.
I don't
have
remember either.
Yeah, I don't remember, but we have someone. Someone's
The
coming.
president will defame some institution, and we'll
Yeah.
have the appropriate person in response.
If you want
Sorry,
to
go
talk,
ahead.
If you want to talk about the telegraph or telephone one day, I can do that.
We would
know,
love
we
to
should
have
have
you
you-
back on.
We should have you and Tom Wheeler both on to
Yeah,
talk
we-
about that.
And
That'd be fun.
Nate Pursley writes in to say that Ann O'Connell, his colleague at Stanford, is an
I know,
expert
Ann.
in administration and the post office, and so that might be a good
That'd be
person
fun.
to have on. If there is yet more going postal in the next couple of days and months, so something to
Somehow,
keep in
I
mind.
think running a campaign against the post office
Weird.
is just not going to be a successful thing.
Weird.
But that's just me. Look, we will be back in 22 hours, 54 minutes. And until then, Kate.
We don't have fun anymore, so in lieu of fun, we have forever stamps.
Oh!